So last time we talked about sensing and seeking. The idea of sensing being, are we paying attention to the world that's out there? Literally, if I'm as a leader or as a team, are we connected with the world, the external world, the world of relationships between my team, other teams, between individuals, and are we paying attention to the I? So individual behaviors, beliefs, values, right? And we talked about seeking, which is to get to the bottom. If sensing shows up the gap, right, we notice the gap, we identify the symptom or the pain in sensing. Seeking is, do we understand what it is about? And so in seeking, do we, have we created hypotheses about what this could be about? Again, we can use the it, the we, and the I. Have we tested them? Have we used some way to sort of verify what seems to be the true root cause of this? And have we defined the goal? Do we really know what we're looking for? And keeping out of the victim trap, when we're seeking, we're creating hypotheses. Are all our hypotheses about somebody else doing something to mess up the situation? Or do we look at what we control? Right? So do we look at how we may be contributing to the gap? We want to move now to solving. And once we understand what the situation is, solving is about being able to create ideas, get potential solutions on the table, turn them into concrete proposals, and then make decisions on what we're going to be able to do. Now, solving gets undercut in a number of ways. If you think about meetings where we're trying to problem solve, one way is that we go from sensing directly to solving without seeking, right? So that we see the problem, and we really immediately go to the question of, okay, what should we do? And we skip seeking, so that we really never get to the bottom of it, right? Another way we can get off track when we go into solving is that we don't differentiate between the expansive conversation to try to get ideas on the table and the contractive conversation, which is to try to break them down into decisions and determine what we are really going to implement. So, for example, imagine you're sitting in a meeting and someone says, we should do Project X. By that statement alone, do I know whether that was an idea that I'm just sort of floating out there to be discussed, whether it was a concrete proposal saying I think we really ought to do this, or was it a decision that we're going to do this? Depending on who's speaking, it could have a lot of different interpretations. If you as the leader use this language, remember that you're going to be interpreted often as either proposing or deciding. So it's useful. I use these words, ideas, proposals, and decisions, so that you can begin to differentiate in your language what stage you're in. And again, as we even talked about earlier, with many gaps in your days, you see the gap, you've seen it before, you know what to do when you solve it, no big deal. Right? So you don't need to go through this big formal process. But for the problems or the challenges that you get stuck in, the ones that keep recurring or that you're unable to solve, getting a bit more discipline on the process is one way to get unstuck. Okay, so I want to take this first with the idea of ideas. So ideas being basically about brainstorming. This is the expansive conversation. How do we get different solution possibilities out on the table? And we talk about brainstorming, but we very rarely do it. So often people say, hey, let's brainstorm. Someone throws out an idea, and then two people attack it. By definition, this isn't brainstorming. So brainstorming has a very sort of concrete set of rules. It's a concrete activity, and it can be done well or poorly. I want to give you 5 rules that can help you in terms of being effective when you brainstorm. So first rule of brainstorming, set a clear question. If you haven't done your seeking, by the way, you're going to notice this is hard to do. Usually the question is something along the lines of, how do we X, right? How do we achieve X? How do we do X? And again, the seeking helps you focus on knowing what you're really solving for. So set that clear question. 2, set a time. Again, often people say, let's brainstorm. A couple ideas come out, people get frustrated, they immediately move into trying to make a decision. There's an interesting phenomenon with setting time around brainstorming, which is if you set a time and you stick with it, you'll get better ideas. So imagine that we set 5 minutes to brainstorm ideas on how to solve a certain problem. In the first minute, minute and a half, all of the old tried and true ideas are going to come out, sort of the things we've done before. Then there's often a period of silence. if you let that silence sit, what you'll find is that new ideas start to come on the other side of the silence. It's actually a necessary part of it. So if you set a time, use the whole time, even if half that time is spent just sitting in silence. What the human mind does when it's faced with silence is it starts questing. It starts trying to find new and different ways to think about the problem. How much time? It depends. How many people are in the brainstorming? How complex is the issue? Right? But the idea, set a time, stick to it. 3, go for quantity. Don't self-filter. So the idea is to get anything that comes into mind up on the board. Your idea may not be a great idea. It doesn't matter because somebody else may be inspired by your idea or may make them think of something. So get anything that comes into your head on the board. And that takes us to 4. Right? By getting just any ideas out on the board, whether they're good or not, it allows you people to build. So your sort of crazy idea becomes a very usable idea from someone else because their thinking is sort of tripped by your idea, and you get better ideas. Last, of course, don't evaluate. It's okay to clarify because that helps in the building process, but evaluating meaning this won't work, we've tried this before, anything that sort of stems the flow. Now, when you are solving, you can use the integral model again because solutions can exist in any of these places. So if you get stuck, are there it solutions? Can we create a process? Can we redo a system? Can we get some different resources? Are there we solutions? Changing how we behave, right? Spending time together, bringing different expertise into the organization. Resetting the values that we're going to use as a team around something. You could have solutions in the I, right? Individuals changing how they show up, how they work. Bringing different individuals in who have different background, different expertise. Looking at solutions and shifting the beliefs or the attitudes of individuals that are in this. So a useful thing in brainstorming is to think, are there solutions across any of the integral model? And it can be a nice thing. Both, we used it in the diagnosis, but as you begin to generate solutions, there are probably solutions that you can generate in most of these boxes. Now, once you have brainstormed and you have the ideas out, the next stage is to move to proposals. And I think it's really useful to differentiate the language of ideas and the language of proposals. I encourage people if you're in a meeting and even if you're not doing formal brainstorming, if you're just throwing out an idea just to be considered, then say it's an idea. So hey, I have an idea. Or look, this isn't a proposal, this is just an idea, let me throw it out. That allows people to respond to it. Now at the point when you really start to want to lock things down, I would propose that you use the language of proposal. I suggest we do this because of this. My proposal is, or I think the best course of action is to. Notice that I'm signaling here that I'm not in brainstorming mode. I'm actually in the contracting conversation. I'm trying to take the mini ideas down to something that's going to be workable and that we're going to move to. Now, as you get into the proposal stage, you may notice that you have several proposals. And the question is, how do you decide? Again, you can look at decisions in a way that maybe is helpful. You can look at it in that there's 5 ways that groups of human beings decide things. One is authority. Right? One person makes the decision, usually the person with the organizational authority. Second, a minority. So usually this is when the person in charge appoints a couple people because, say, of their expertise and say, these people are going to go off and they're going to decide. By the way, that small minority group is still going to have to use one of the next 3 to make the decision within themselves. Majority, we vote, right? We determine a percentage. If it's 51%, 66%, or whatever, we agree that whatever the majority comes to, on the vote, we'll accept. Consensus and unanimity are slightly different, and I do like to distinguish because I do think there's 2 very separate concepts here. I define consensus as everyone is able to live with the decision. So in consensus, any one person has veto power. But in consensus, you're also allowed to say, look, it's not my favorite idea, but I'm willing to support it and commit to it. Notice I can live with it even though I don't love it. That's okay for consensus. The difference in unanimity is that that to disagree and commit is no longer an option. Unanimity means that everyone has to love it. Now, as you've probably noticed, the higher up in this, the faster the decision, but the less buy-in, and the lower you go down, the greater the buy-in to the decision, but the longer it's probably going to take. So, for example, when would you ever want unanimity? Well, imagine a situation where you're in a team and every person on the team is going to have to go out and be an evangelist for the decision. They're going to have to go out and convert others to adopt the decision. Disagree and commit is probably not going to work. And if you have consensus, and there's some people who say, yeah, I can live with it, but I'm not that crazy about it. If they have to go out and individually evangelize this idea, it's probably not going to work. That's when I'd use an unanimity. You have to have full love of the idea. Right? When do I use authority? Well, when speed's important, or when I as a leader have a very specific way I want something done. So one of the keys in the decision making is to be clear on how you're going to decide before you get into the decision. So it's most common when I work with teams, the team starts into a decision conversation and they haven't decided how they're going to decide. Usually the default is consensus until such time as the leader gets fed up or impatient, and then it reverts to authority. Now what happens there, since the method for making the decision hasn't been clearly articulated, people are going to be unhappy with what happens. I thought it was going to be consensus, but then the leader just made the call. Or I'm unhappy because it was consensus and I thought the leader should just be making the call. So I would say the person running the meeting for any given agenda item, say up front, look, we're going to discuss this and then I'm going to decide it. So this is an authority decision. Or, hey, we're going to vote on this and we're going to live with majority rules. Now, when you stipulate what the decisions and method's going to be, as a leader, you've got to stick with it. If you say we're going to have consensus, and then you get impatient and you pull it back to yourself and say, this is taking too long, here's what we're going to do. The next time you say consensus, people are not going to believe you. So whatever it is, stick to it. Now, you can do a hybrid. So for example, you might say, look, we're going to try for consensus, but if we haven't reached consensus after 15 minutes, then we're going to vote. Now, I think that's useful unless it becomes every time the same thing and it always resolves to the secondary method, right? So, for example, if you say, well, we'll do consensus and then we're going to vote, and people just sort of stall till the vote comes because they know they can force it, you're not going to trust the proposal that we try for consensus first. So if you say a hybrid, you have to really work for the consensus first. Once you have the method, review the criteria. So what are the criteria we're using to make this decision? Is it speed? Is it usability? Is it cost? Right? So knowing those things helps us to make decisions, particularly if we're doing majority consensus or unanimity. So be explicit and have a discussion about how we're making the conversation or how we're making the decision. And the last is you just do it. You decide. Right? Now, deciding closes the solving. We have a solution. We've decided on it. And very often teams end here. And the danger in ending here is that a decision is not an action. Right? So often I'll be working with a team and they'll decide something. They'll say, yeah, we should do this. Everyone agree, yes, we have consensus. We should do this. They go away, they come back in the next meeting and no one's taken any action. I believe this is because they failed to move from solving to what I call starting. This is moving back into the world. How do we take a decision or an idea or a solution and really make it implementable? And again, there's a few stages to do this when we think about it. Number one is have a plan. So moving from the decision to know what are going to be the steps. And actually, once for complex things that they're doing, most teams are fairly good at this, creating a plan. And there's all kinds of. This is where your project management tools come in, your Gantt charts, your PERT analysis, critical path, all that kind of stuff. So have the plan. But even the plan isn't enough. Commitments for me is where we often break down. And what I mean by commitments is literally the creation of a contract. Who will do what by when? And it's not enough. I think the mistake we make in commitments is we either hint, well, hey, I'd like you to do this, or we demand, hey, you have to do this. And neither one of those creates a contract. So what I mean by commitment is a request and a response. So someone's saying, will you do this by this time to these criteria? And the person says yes. Then and only then do we have a commitment. So checking that person, you don't just assign a task, but that the person accepts the task, right? So then we have real commitment. The only thing left after that is to actually act. And interestingly, acting gives us data, which allows us to move back to sensing, right? So by acting, we pay attention to what was the impact of the actions on the it, the we, and the I. If it closed the gap, fantastic. If it didn't close the gap, why not? Well, we go back to seeking, and we stay in this cycle until one of two things either happens. Either we close the gap, right, we achieve the goal, or we get close enough that we say, that additional effort isn't worth the investment, right? So that the outcome that it would create. So we may actually make a decision in sensing at some point to say, or sensing and seeking, the problem really isn't serious enough to continue. This is good enough. And we go on. Now, all of this can be done in a person's head. When we problem solve by ourselves, we can do each of these stages just thinking it through on our own. If we're going to collaboratively problem solve, then we have to use language to be able to do this. The next session that we're going to do is to talk about literally the language that makes this problem solving in a group work well.